Hello, friends. Welcome to the Nexus podcast. I'm your host, James Dice. Each week, I fire questions at the leaders of the smart buildings industry to try to figure out where we're headed and how we can get there faster without all the marketing fluff. I'm pushing my learning to the limit, and I'm so glad to have you here following along. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Nexus Pro. Nexus Pro is an annual or monthly subscription where members get exclusive writing, podcasts, and invites to members-only Zoom gatherings. You can find info on how to join and support the podcast at nexuslabs.online. Without further ado, please enjoy this episode of the Nexus podcast. All right, episode 37 is a conversation with Shannon Smith, CEO of PointGuard, a building analytics software company out of North Carolina in the U.S. Shannon and I have had several offline conversations, so it was fun to finally hit record for this one. We talked about all things analytics in 2021, including where the actual market is today compared to where we in the Nexus community wish it was. There were several subtopics within that I like to call analytics for X. So we talked about analytics for capital planning, analytics for COVID, analytics for risk mitigation, and more. So for all of you data nerds, building performance nerds, without further ado, please enjoy Nexus Podcast episode 37. All right, Shannon Smith, welcome to the show. I'm excited to unpack some things with you today. Can you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Well, look, I'm Shannon Smith. I'm the CEO of PointGuard in Charlotte, North Carolina. And, James, one of the first things I want to do is just thank you for Nexus. I know we've talked about this offline, but I've really enjoyed it. Of course, the pod and the newsletters are interesting. And a couple of our team members are Nexus Pro. And I've actually used your labs with one of our new onboarding hires. So it's all great stuff. What I really appreciate the most are some of these new friends I now talk to offline, either to rant with or to work with. But I think the other thing that surprised me is I've enjoyed really listening to other CEOs like me talk about their business.
Yeah.
And perspective, like Deb Nolan or the Brainbox guy. I think that stuff is good because we're all in it together, and it's good to hear what other folks are saying. So thanks for what you're doing.
Yeah, something you told me about a month ago or so is that you and Terry, so Terry was on episode 9. You and Terry have become friends. So shout out to Terry.
Shout out to those breakout rooms in Nexus Pro, because that's where we really get to talk and get to know each other. So that's good.
Awesome. Cool. Well, before we unpack everything we're going to talk about today, which is a lot around analytics for buildings, can you take us through like how you got to this point? How did you end up where you're at today?
Sure. Well, you told me to be quick, and it is quick, but we have a little bit of an interesting origin story. And I started Abundant Power, which is PointGuard's parent company, in 2009 after a career in private equity and mergers and acquisitions. So I'm a finance guy, got my MBA at the University of Virginia. And then before that was some philosophy and economics, double major, and then did grad school in French Lit.
Wow.
Before I went to Wall Street. So I'm not the typical, engineering background. But what I wanted to do in 2009 was solve a planetary problem using a commercial solution. In fact, that's our motto at our company is commercial solutions for planetary problems. And the one we really wanted to go after was climate change. So PointGuard is part of a family of companies, 2 other companies, but I spend all my time on the software business. So that's sort of my background. And then PointGuard started as well as a finance company.
Can I pause you real quick? Can you tell me about these these paintings of these office chairs? So for those of you that are just listening on audio, Shannon, before we get into the nerdy stuff, I have to ask, there's 2 painted, one red, one blue office chairs on his wall behind him.
Well, I am the father of 2 sets of twins. And part of the reason why I actually left my Wall Street job was to be more present with my kids. And so I have a wall of art up here that is their artwork. And that's what my son and daughter painted probably when they were 7 or 8 years old. Okay.
I didn't know if you were just in your office and you're bored. When you're bored, you paint office materials.
My kids are much more artistic than I am, but I'm lucky that reminds me of them. So, yeah.
All right, cool. Sorry to interrupt you. Let's go. Go back to PointGuard. What were you going to say?
Yeah. So just the origin story there was a little different because we did start out in finance. In fact, we were managing a big finance program through one of our other finance companies, Clean Source Capital, for the state of Alabama, and introduced to them around 2014 this idea to finance control systems upgrades and then would repay the loan to buy those control system upgrades over a period of time using the savings generated by the control system itself.
Yep.
And we looked at a lot of software and ended up going with Sky Foundry. And to help these customers do that, and of course, I called Petsy up and I said, "What the hell have you sold me?" He said, "Hire a developer and team him up with one of your engineers," and that's how we that's how we got started. And we grew and grew, but it was a shared savings model. And finally, we spun PointGuard off in 2018 because a number of our customers asked us if they could use the software. And so we decided it could in fact be used by others. And so at the very end of 2018, we launched PointGuard, spun it out in a different subsidiary, and brought in some investors in 2019. So I think Matt Schwartz in one of your podcasts said we got sucked into BMS, kind of didn't expect to get here. The people asked me how we got into PointGuard, and I said walking backwards.
I actually said that. That was me who said that. I feel like I came at this industry from the energy management angle. You know, I'm fresh out of school, want to change the world, want to save energy, and BMS controls has just sucked me in for the last 10 years because you can't ignore it. You can't ignore all the problems there if you want to solve the bigger ones.
Not at all. So yeah, so we kind of come at it from a finance perspective and did look at the shared savings model, which is out there, but then ultimately went for a straight SaaS model eventually in 2018.
Cool. All right. Before we get into PointGuard in a little bit more detail, let's go with a couple of my favorite questions here. So let's do the historical one. I know because you and I have had these conversations before. Why do you think technology is so far behind? Even though we're in 2021, we'll do the 2020 question one more time.
Well, I guess there's nothing new to add. I mean, I've listened to your podcast enough to know that I violently agree with most of all the perspectives that have already been identified. Lack of standards, OEM entrenchments, split incentives or bad incentives for the OEMs and building owners. I wrote down lack of talent or no IT talent, organizational structure. Someone, I think in one of your podcasts, talked about the distance from buyers to users, which I think is relevant.
It's a huge one. Yeah.
But, I thought maybe just adding a perspective or two from my background in private equity and finance, and also being a student of business models. We've talked about this some over time, but I want to amplify it, which is this idea that real estate is more of a debt instrument of value than an equity instrument of value. And there is a difference. The real estate industry has been around for a long time. Some could say it's the world's largest asset class. Our market alone is 40% of the real estate world. And I had a guy from Wells Fargo once tell me, a pretty senior person, that the American real estate industry and all the ancillary industries is larger than the Chinese economy. So that may deserve some fact checking, but it's directionally correct. And just says that market is an entrenched market, and creating change in the space. One of the core instruments for financing real estate is something called a bond indenture. Bonds are debt, and debt is a debt instrument. So bond indentures are these excruciating legal documents that basically set the rules in place for the duration of that bond or the debt instrument. Okay. And again, I'm comparing that to real estate. And basically, that instrument, that bond indenture, is a 20-page, 40-page piece of paper. It's not supposed to be looked at unless things go wrong. And what that means is everybody does the same thing for 20 years. Okay, so that is what the debt mentality is. And that mentality exists throughout everywhere in real estate versus an equity mindset that's always evaluating risk and opportunities in real time. So it's being a risk adverse mentality or cost versus profit mentality. And I see that everywhere. I mean, I've been surprised, I go to ULI a lot, and how the leaders in real estate pay lip service to technology, but they don't really understand it or have a vision for it. It's just not the way they think.
And how do you think that is shifting, or is that?
Well, I do think it'll shift. I do think that the health of real estate organizations, or any organization, frankly, when I used to sit on boards of companies, could be determined by its ability to accept change and implement technology. And I learned this from my investment background. What I've found is a lot of real estate organizations really aren't organizations. They're not run that way. There tends to be a dysfunctional relationship between leadership and facility management. Facility management is not sexy, cost cutting, nothing to see here, run to fail. I've seen
Yeah.
where like some of these organizations, that folks that lead it, they have a person that runs facility management. They call that person Bob or Gene, and they know Bob and Gene do important things, but they really don't want to know what they do.
Yeah.
And that kind of lack of core to the business model, I think is absolutely one of the main reasons why we're so far behind. There's a Moore's curve of adopting technology, and there's behind the laggards for all other industries. There's another Moore's curve for adopting technology where the real estate industry sits. So, new adopters in real estate are behind laggards and everyone else. I mean, that's sort of the view. So debt mentality, dysfunctional relationship versus equity mentality, and sort of a core healthy organizational structure are things that to me are more systemic in nature. Things that could change that really, I think, are going to be the two things that threaten that model, which is talent drain and tenant focus. And I think talent drain is a real problem that will ultimately affect these models in the downturn. Particularly, a lot of real estate industries turn to cost cutting and fee-based businesses, and the talent's not there. It's hard, it's difficult. And that will get everyone's attention. And then the new tenant focus that's been emerging around what tenants want. And even in our side of the facility management business, we believe that you can actually customize a building to the tenants that are in it. So we think that'll help. COVID's a big deal. I think I was listening to an economist speak the other day. He thought that COVID will impact us similarly to how the Great Depression impacted, a generation of people's thinking. And so we'll see what happens, but for sure it didn't change history. It just accelerated it. So I think these models, these two core systemic issues are going to be important.
And what do you mean by the talent drain? Who specifically?
Well, I think just, senior techs, versus junior techs, the types of buildings that have to be managed, the amount of time that's available. I mean, we're seeing our customers have an A team and 5 C teams.
Got it. Yeah. And the A team could retire at any time.
The A team retires and it moves from project to project. And when they bring the C team in, then they have a lot of building drift. Our software is a solution for that. So
let's get into that. So what is PointGuard? Do you consider, is it just software company or services wrapped around it, or kind of take us through it?
Yeah, well, sure. Well, so we're a BMS overlay that you've used that terminology that uses Sky Foundry as a core part, although it's only about 5% of our code stack. But we have some 7 key components to what we do. We have energy, which is smart metering, circuit meter, benchmarking, classic, stuff. Data onboarding is a part of what we do, and we're productizing a number of things there that I'd love to talk about.
Okay.
We do fault detection around asset comfort, et cetera. Then we do the advanced diagnostics, which is some of the things that are important to you, like sensors. We're sensor compatible. We do have some automated supervisor control. The area that's really near and dear to my heart is our long-term capital and operating analytics, which is where we get into asset sensors and machine learning. And then the other 2 areas is workflow. You've always said that's important. We thought it was too. We have workflow, as well as some tenant management apps like off-hours requests. We have a product called Goldilocks and a few other things. So I don't like using the word platform, because one of the things I'll tell you right off the top is that I think you've had this debate on your podcast. That terminology is challenging. We're a tool. We're an important tool for our customers, and we try to meet them where they are and what they need.
It's really refreshing to hear you say that. The word platform, as people have heard me say, is just so thrown around, so overused. So it's really refreshing to see you actually downplaying it a little bit. So thank you for that. So I'll kind of want to get into, I think you have some progressive views around analytics, and you kind of agree with me and a lot of my progressive ideas around analytics, I think. Let's talk about, though, maybe some like status quo, old way to do it. Sort of like, what's the state of the analytics industry right now? And maybe I'll kick us off. So I'm writing this piece right now, and it'll be sending out to members before this podcast does, just one day before. And the premise that I'm working around is like, we make a lot of promises about analytics. So predictive maintenance, we're going to digitize facility management, right? We're going to create X% of savings. So some people throw around 20%. And I don't want to like throw that under the bus, because I am potentially the biggest believer in this topic, but I am maybe challenging the industry a little bit here in that how much of those promises are actually true today. 10 years into analytics becoming this thing that, is generally accepted as a good idea. And so I'd love to get your thoughts around like where we're at before we talk about kind of where we need to head. Where are we at, and what are some of like the misconceptions and the challenges with where we're at today with this?
Well, there's so many, people that listen to this podcast that have, really amazing perspectives. I mean, my view, coming at it the way we described earlier, coming at it backwards as a finance, we kind of woke up and said, oh my God, there's an industry here. There's this word called prop tech and cre-tech, and I call it the shallow alto verbalization words that are not very practical. I mean, we say our software is data that turns a wrench. If you're not driving toward turning a wrench, which nothing good's happening in the building unless a wrench is turned. And if there's not ROI, so we really focus on profit, because it's all about profit. And businesses are about profit, and the business of facility management is about turning a wrench. So I think words matter. I don't believe in transformation. I believe in enhancing. I don't believe in platforms. I believe in tools. And I think the word usage you're talking about there is oftentimes due to the shallow alto, where we tend to communicate where we want the industry to be versus where it actually is. And
what do you mean by shallow alto? Like as opposed to Palo Alto? What do you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Because the Palo Alto, venture capitalists are great. I mean, heck, I was in an adjacent industry to that. And there are probably people that want to take business models from other places, other sectors of our economy and say, well, it applies here and let's use the same terminology. And I think that can be dangerous, right? And then we overshoot where we really are in terms of our promises, and we then underdeliver, and we create false positives, false negatives, and then we lose credibility, and it damages the whole industry. So I think that's just an important thing.
So if people talk about things like as if they exist, where are we at? Where's the market at right now?
Well, I think there's been some acknowledgement that, well, first of all, I think there's way too much data. I mean, the customers are confused. I think you have like 160 folks on your list of buyers. And on one hand, I was looking this up out of curiosity, and right at the turn of the century, there were over 400 automobile manufacturers in the United States.
Okay.
So I think we're kind of in the same spot. Now the choices are more reasonable, but I can't imagine, how 400 cars you could choose from.
You mean at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century?
At the turn of the 20th century. Sorry. Yeah. When cars came along. Right?
Okay.
So I think there's a lot of customer confusion, and confused customers don't buy. It's paralyzing. And you have everyone saying the same things. And some of these same words, some words that have been hollowed out, and some words that don't apply to the industry. So I think we're at risk of doing that. But at the same time, I'm super bullish. Another issue that is out there that I would argue pretty strongly about, and I've heard some of the CEOs talk about this in a productive manner, is there's too much data. I mean, we're kind of in love with data. And I agree that data has tremendous value and there's a lot to come out. But I really believe in the Pareto principle, and not all data is created equal. And some data is good to have, and some really drives value. And we're trying to actually organize our user experience that way on our portal, where you can kind of get to the things you want quickly. And then all the other data, what category to put it. But when you open up some of these platforms and screens, it's this data overload. And we've seen that from our customers. This is overwhelming. What you created is a Cadillac product. And what I need is a Honda Civic.
Yeah.
And so that's where we've had to move our product. Is we have a monthly product now that provides one item that we automatically curate, that we provide with a guarantee of NOI or ROI on it, so that they'll never pay us more than they pay for this service. And it's very bite-sized stuff, and goes down to some of the things like what Switch did with their, I think, DX product. We have something similar. Those kind of bite-sized products and value-driven products where the data is got a hard direct line to ROI versus data for data's sake.
Yeah.
Is something that we're dealing with. And I think we're kind of chopping our way with a machete out of those woods, because we all ran into it screaming data and machine learning. And we got confused, and our customers got confused.
I love it. I love it. And I think that there's a lot there to be learned for a lot of the startups out there, because you see a lot of their marketing around the finished product. And I think eyes glaze over. I think, yeah, where we're trying to get to 10 years from now is autonomy. And if you work backwards from that, you're going to have some really cool product. But like right now, like you said, you're just handing one insight per month. Like, go fix this damper this month, and then we'll talk to you next month. Like, that's where the marketplace is today. And
yeah, and another thing that's out there are pilots. I mean, pilots are, if you think about pilots, you tell me, okay, so I got to use this for a year, or how long before I find out whether it's worth anything, or you got a case study, which is someone else's building. And we try to reimagine. We now do a 30-day snapshot and say, you don't have to hire us for a year just to see if this thing works. Hire us for 30 days.
Totally.
And make it less painful. And I would encourage that, the whole pilot, land and expand. I do believe in that business model, but I also think it can be right sized for the market we're dealing with.
Yeah. And I think something that complicates analytics deployments today is that when you have, say, per point and then volume pricing, the people that are doing the analytics project are a little bit incentivized to pull in all the data, get all the points, because, you start to get volume. It becomes cheaper per point, cheaper per system to do that. But really, it's about tailoring that solution for the customer. So that's sort of irrelevant what happens on the back end. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the conversations you're having about ontologies and all that are absolutely critical. I mean, we're a haystack house, but we want to talk about those things. But the customer is on a path, and it's our job as in this industry to meet them where they are on that path. Not to be yelling at them from the end of the path, telling them that they're losers if they're not over here. And in fact, that's what we call it, the PointGuard path. And we try to find those products. And there are a lot of other good ones out there, our competitors that are offering similar things. I think we're starting to do that more.
Cool. Let's talk about this need for consolidation. I didn't actually realize you had this private equity background. So I've heard others talk about, there's this whole SPAC, is that SPAC situation going on. I just exposed my financial ignorance there. So I think there's a lot of people that think there's a lot of consolidation opportunity in our industry. I think my vendor landscape backs that up with, here's this list of 160 companies, something like 80 of which call themselves analytics companies. They can't all survive. They can't all, and to be fair, there are different verticals within there. I have some that are focused on refrigerated retail. I have some that are focused on XYZ vertical, right?
Right.
But for all intents and purposes, there's too many companies doing analytics. So educate me around consolidation. Like, how do you think this is going to work?
Yeah, I mean, look, I love this company. We have an amazing team, but I also know you have to look at where we sit in the market. You have to look at what's a logical outcome for this space. I do believe that there's a tension between point solution. Well, let me first off say I'm super bullish. Like I said earlier, they're Ford automobile makers at the turn of the 20th century, and I think we're in a similar place in our industry. The market's in a very early stage, and there is a big market out there, and a lot of companies can survive. I mean, our break even is minuscule compared to the size of the market we serve, and even the size of the market here in the Southeast where we're headquartered. So from that perspective, it's great, but the reality is it is confusing, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, it's natural for us to be part of people having a larger conversation where a convergence is 1 + 1 = 3. So for groups like us, which you put us in sort of an AFDD, maybe an ASC space, and a number of things, we're a logical partner to some CMMS platforms. In fact, we're working with several right now and integrating with them, or space management platforms on that side. We are also working with control system vendors that want to install our software in their control system. So those are other channels where people are already in a conversation where they control the line of scrimmage with the customer, and maybe provide less confusion to the customer, and can then provide a more comprehensive solution. And I think all that's going to happen over time. And on top of that, there'll be some just straight inside our sector consolidation, which needs to happen. But again, that requires some lack of ego, some investment mentality, maybe the equity mentality I talked about earlier. And when you have a lot of startups, everyone loves their baby, right? So it's kind of hard to drop them off at kindergarten, which is what we're going to have to do over time. And I do think that there are some consolidations happening. I sometimes wonder if the sector-focused funds have been good for the industry or not. I think probably a net positive, but it does create some fragmentation that may not be necessary.
Totally.
So I'm optimistic. I think there's an increase went from about 80 to 100 deals broadly in our space, not just in the space, James, that you speak to. I think over the next 2 to 3 years, we should anticipate a lot of consolidation and more, I would say, strategic, intentional partnering, which certainly PointGuard plans to be a part of.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different types of consolidation, not just companies getting acquired.
Yep, for sure. And I think that is important. One thing I'd love to just bring up with you that I don't see being talked about in our space, which I think could be an interesting conversation as a group to have, which is how we move from being a vitamin to a painkiller. That's what I like to think about it.
Okay.
And I think one path for us is thinking about our industry more in terms of risk reduction versus performance enhancing.
Okay.
So, and that's why I'm so fascinated, why we got early on into moving into what our capital budgeting as a big area, because real estate's one of the only major, in fact, I think it's the last industry sector that doesn't use condition-based data for capital replacement. It's a big area of opportunity because it embodies risk. Now, 82% of equipment breakdowns are unplanned. Property condition assessments, which asset managers used and people use to plan out capital budgeting, are useless for the most part. I mean, it's amazing to me, James, that when you buy a building, a Class A office building today, how little information from the BMS control system gets into that report of risk. I mean, it's a dirty little secret about the PCAs, and there are a lot of interests that could fight against that. But if you think about
what's a PCA?
A property condition assessment.
Yeah. Okay.
So I just feel like we're understanding what the analytics side, particularly the BMS analytics, has to say about risk in a building versus performance in the building, and could be a place where this industry would grow. I mean, think about the property condition assessment industry. That industry is required by banks and insurance companies to buy buildings. So it's a check the box, right?
Right.
And so I think of it like the environmental risk business, where you have a phase 1, a phase 2, and a phase 3.
Okay.
So phase 1 is there anything to see here? And that could be something like our snapshot or some of these other products. Is there risk here in this building based on the real-time data coming off the control system? If there is, second would be environmental phase 2. I mean, these are Googleable, so the listeners who've never heard of a phase 2 can go Google it. But the phase 2 is within this time to create a remediation plan, and start to remediate. And then phase 3, is how do we then cap it off? So that kind of compliance framework and risk reduction framework, I think, is actually available to us. It's just not being accessed enough. We've made some outreaches to insurance companies and lenders, but I think that there's an opportunity for all of us to consider that kind of conversation. And it does a number of things. It speaks the language of debt, right? It moves what we do into a compliance framework. It also opens us up to the core model of real estate and to the leaders of the real estate industry, I think, long term, and other people that haven't used this, like asset managers and owners who don't actually think too much about what we do, except for the leaders. And there are some great leaders out there. And I think all of us have customers who are leaders, but there's so many we don't have, which are followers, and those, or not doers at all. In fact, I had an asset manager of a very, very large company that you would know the name of, told me he had 50 asset managers, and that for 49 and a half of them, doing nothing was the appropriate course of action.
Okay.
That's what we're dealing with. So I do believe risk, when you start revealing how we frame risk, that's an opportunity, and I'd love to see it discussed more.
Yeah, this is something that when I just there's a LinkedIn conversation happening. So when this episode comes out, it'll be a week ago now, but people are I think there's a misconception that analytics is a tool for the building operator, which I'm not saying it's not, but I'm saying it's not an either or thing. I'm not saying we need to create analytics for the building operators only, right? I think that something that you just spoke of is like there's different stakeholders that can get value out of the same data. And it's the analytics job. This is an opinion that I'm developing. Analytics job to curate the insights for whoever's specifically logging in, right? So the building operator might care about the broken valve, but the person buying the building, tomorrow might care about the history of that valve over time and how many times it's required to be replaced, just making up an example. But they might care about their risk, is what you're saying, for when that valve's going to break tomorrow, or how many valves do I have across this whole building that need to be replaced right now? And what sort of tenant comfort issues are those causing that I'm going to have to deal with once I acquire this building? Like those are different insights for different people. And I think that when I start to think about analytics 2.0, I'm starting to think about how our products need to start to mature so that they start to solve different problems for different people. It's not a narrowing, I don't think. I think it's an expansion.
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. You have your persona, and then you find out, how you can meet them on their path. I think, again, it goes back to language. For example, predictive and prescriptive analytics, great term, love it, believe in it. But there's already like problem sets that go well before that, on the capital budgeting side. And again, I want to keep stressing this capital piece is equally or more important piece to our future than the operating piece, because it's a bigger number and it affects more stakeholders in the real estate ecosystem.
Totally.
And so meeting those personas, our CapEx is just adding real-time data into an existing rubric for making capital budgeting decisions. You don't necessarily have to go all the way into prescriptive and use words like AI. You can say, take this data into consideration. Right. You have a willing audience for that. And you don't have to do advanced modeling and all this kind of stuff. This industry is still run by Excel spreadsheets. So just have to remember that. You have to fit into that environment, not another environment.
Yeah, and this is where you were getting at. You mentioned workflows and how I like to tie things to workflows earlier. So tying the new insight into someone's workflow is a step up from what a lot of people are doing on the analytics side. I think right now, the state of the art, if you will, on analytics is that they're saying, here's this dashboard, or here's this KPI. But what we really need is we have to go one step further and say, what persona are we affecting with that? And what workflow are we inserting it into? I think all the people out there applying the analytics, that's what applying it means. That's what human in the loop means. It's about what human and what loop, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And we should be developing our product. And look, we're not innocent. Okay, we've certainly chased a bright, shiny thing here and there. And I'm probably in our team the one most guilty of that. But if your users or your personas, the people that aren't driving your development, you're probably following a shallow alto path that could get so far ahead of your customer you'll never have one. And I think that's important to where we're headed.
Hey guys, just another quick note from our sponsor, Nexus Labs, and then we'll get back to the show. This episode is brought to you by Nexus Foundations, our introductory course on the smart buildings industry. If you're new to the industry, this course is for you. If you're an industry vet but want to understand how technology is changing things, this course is also for you. The alumni are raving about the content, which they say pulls it all together, and they also loved getting to meet the other students on the weekly Zoom calls and in the private chat room. You can find out more about the course at courses.nexuslabs.online. All right, back to the interview. Cool. So what else needs to happen for this to go to mainstream? I know you wanted to talk about onboarding. Is that one of the topics you wanted to hit?
Well, yeah, I've been encouraged by some of my colleagues in the space. We certainly have begun to do more of this stuff, which is just, I call it a prebiotic, meaning that even when we have our snapshot, which is a precursor to implementing the technology, we found that there are even smaller analytic prebiotics that you can put in your stomach to improve your digestion. If you know that term, okay, so it's just sort of like things that just kind of get everything ready to be digested and are smaller bite sizes. So the data onboarding. You have teams that just need help with that. You have teams that may want a data lake. I mean, people use the term digital twin, but we can provide things like that. You have products that are cybersecurity scans. You have products that do sequence of operations. That's all they do. Okay, testing function products. So that, again, it just allows people to begin to build trust to solve a direct problem that is out there that makes their lives easier. Our goal is to help people make decisions, better decisions more quickly, I think. It's not that fancy. It's not that sexy. I mean, that's what we're supposed to be doing as a company and helping them make money, right? And so
right.
Those are how we try to orient our development turn. And I think that those things, the more we can help people move on to the path, I guess, and not just talk about AI and, automated control, which I know you and I have gone back and forth at. I said, sure, I believe that's going to happen. I think we need to manage our expectations of the scope and when it'll happen. But the building that's fully automated that doesn't have a human involved is about as inevitable as a paperless bathroom. And so, and so we just got to tone it down a little bit and say, okay, and there are customers that are interested in some of that automated set point adjustment, but most are not. And most would just love for you to help them with sequence of operations, and most would just like you to help them with some straightforward things, and allows them to get their feet wet and move down that path. And I think those things could be helpful in our industry. Again, it goes to your point, platforms. The issue that the other issue is clearly this one of just speaking to each other and being able to have these buildings that are more open. That conversation I thought was fantastic, and we certainly fight that battle every day.
Yeah.
And really believe in some of these products that are out there. We have our own, like Voltron, but ours is not in Python, but in Java. So we love this type of stuff. That has to happen as well.
Yeah, totally. It's funny when you talked about onboarding, I thought you meant like these platforms like you were just talking about, but you were also talking about kind of leading the customer into the path, onboarding them into this analytics journey. We could talk about machine learning to onboard buildings really quickly and integrate, but there's also, you're leading someone onto the path, and there's always a first step. And I think what we're doing is skipping a lot of maybe easier first steps that could be getting people onto the path. Love it.
I think that's a really important part, at least. And you and I were speaking beforehand. I feel like we've learned this probably through making mistakes, not necessarily because we started with a grand vision, but it became pretty clear. And unfortunately for me, we have some good mechanical engineers here who, when I would go to a conference and come back with these terminologies, they would just look at me and scratch their head and go, "What are you talking about?" We need. They would just say to me, "Shannon, we need data that turns a wrench." And I said, "Okay, I'm gonna go back to my desk." But but it finally sunk in. Eventually, I may be done, but I'm slow, and I've picked up on this, and now I'm completely a believer in it. And then once I kind of began to put those lenses on, you begin to see. I don't necessarily think our industry is making like fundamental massive errors, but I do sometimes worry that we can kind of get lost in our own conversation sometimes, and if we're lost, then our customers for sure are.
Totally. So something I wanted to ask you about before we kind of get towards wrapping up, I wanted to ask you also about service contracts. So it's kind of hand in hand with capital planning. Again, a different stakeholder, right? But same data that could be useful to a different workflow, right? Talk to me about what you're seeing in that area.
Well, we're kind of new. We believe this is important. We've been working with outsourced facility management groups and ESCOs. In fact, we just won a pretty big one with a large facility management company yesterday, about 3 million square feet. But the idea there is that they can use this to stay sticky. They can use it to prove their worth, which is oftentimes not completely understood.
Totally.
They can use it to verify their actions. In fact, one of the things we offer in our software is vendor verification, which verifies that the actions were actually, the data supports that the equipment was indeed repaired. Mm-hmm. And it does allow them to reimagine how they negotiate and set up service level agreements.
Love it. Yeah.
If I could come back and start a facility management company that was totally tech enabled. I mean, these companies do struggle because it goes against It's sort of like someone saying you're going to have to stop drinking. And you don't really want to stop drinking, like or beer or something like that,
Yeah.
and so they really have to, well, it's going to be good for you and you'll like it when you're on the other side of it. And we've seen a few companies that have really embraced this and begun to really think about it, but I would say the industry is still in nascent stage about how this can really help them. And maybe you've seen something, James, I haven't, but we're just seeing that conversation start with 3 or 4 of our customers, and we're encouraged, but we're not like, no one's buying a new boat based on that.
I think it goes back to the vitamin or painkiller thing. I think if their competitors start to create analytics driven SLAs and start to provide higher value and prove that higher value and potentially even have a higher return on the owner's investment, and then now they're competing against someone who's not, I think that, so Alex Grace from Clockworks on episode 4 called it the carrot or the stick, right? I think there's a potential flip that could potentially start to happen.
Well, this COVID thing is true. I mean, I think Deb mentioned it in your conversation with her about, that we saw kind of the whole market taser for about 4 to 6 months, but this whole idea of remote work and a little more efficient on your truck rolls, and then empty buildings, and yet still having to manage them, and those are the types of things where that's may take a year or 2, but it's going to affect facility management, I think, for quite some time to come.
Totally.
And I think our industry is well suited to meet those needs as long as we talk about it in the right way. Turn a wrench and make a profit.
Love it. Cool, Shannon. So a couple of things for 2021. I got like 3 layers of questions as we kind of look towards the future here. So number 1, I want to ask you about COVID first. So analytics for COVID, right, is something that I think it's been talked about, but I don't know that it's really been celebrated enough. So it's beyond just remote access, remote monitoring. So what else is it, and what are you excited about for that?
Well, I think there's obviously enterprise level value around remote building management, but if you're thinking about analytics for COVID, I mean, we offer a building health check and use sensors to help, and I think that's a real opportunity to the extent that that's a real thing. I think that there's a lot of confusion still in the facility management world. If you go on FMI, places like that, about really what's the best strategy for making tenants or occupants excited to come back into buildings. But having some benchmarking around that is important. I had someone say everything starts with benchmarking, and maybe that's another point to make. Having good benchmarks, even around the BMS, are important, and what's going on. And so building health is a benchmark, and we can create that just like Energy Star scores. And so we're working hard with products like that. And I think that's a real opportunity for our industry.
Yeah. And this is another area where I feel like there's some platform misconception, because there's a lot of IAQ companies, many of which listen to this podcast, but they're coming in, not saying anyone's doing anything wrong here, but coming in saying, here's my sensor, I'm going to provide a vertical solution. They're usually going to call it a platform, but it's basically a way for you to view that data, right? And it's basically a new silo, right? It's a IAQ silo, right? We had all these other silos and now we have another one, right? And so how do you guys think about, like, because really it should start to be swallowed up by the existing overlay, provided in context with all the other data, and then provided into a workflow that you're already hitting, right?
I agree with that. And look, I get it. And I do think sensors play a role in buildings that can't be retrofitted or the smaller buildings in the 75 degrees might be doing stuff like that. But the BMS is an already deployed sensor system. So why not first check that out, right? And then that's why we just announced we do sensors too, but we have our own that we actually just buy and integrate into our data and workflow. But again, it goes back to the Pareto principle. We look at the zone density, we look at what the data is telling us, where the gaps are. That's where you deploy sensors. But you don't have to go beyond that. Now, there may be some IQ density there around carbon that you might need more information on, but relative to COVID, you don't. And so we're interested to see how this plays out. But I think the BMS plus sensors is a more logical step than those 2 things being siloed. And I think that's your point.
Yep. Cool. So my new 2021 question is, I know I skipped it earlier. So what's the number one thing you think needs to change to unlock the industry in the next year?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we kind of covered it. I think having real estate's business model be threatened by either talent or tenant is one, and moving just from expanding our vocabulary from performance to risk is the other.
Love it. You cheated, but I'll take it. I think those are both great answers and unique answers too. So what are you excited about personally? What are you guys looking forward to rolling out in 2021?
Well, we're super excited about some of these integrations with the CMMS partners and the controls partners. These smaller bite-sized products, our sensor product, and we will relaunch our Goldilocks product toward the end of the year, which will be it's sort of a dumbed down comfy, where it's more of a placebo thermostat, but allows tenants to basically customize their space and allows facility management to respond to it. So those are some ideas that are way out there. And we do think there's going to be some other types of integrations that we want to add in. We've been asked to put water in one customer, lighting in another. So we'll play around with those, but the integrations are the ones I'm most excited about, I think. And this Insight product that I told you about, which is just the monthly one thing, we'll see how that goes. So.
Cool. Yeah. So integrating with more systems in the building, but also different cloud applications as well.
Yeah, we got to join more conversations. I don't know how many CMMS people are on your Nexus Pro, but there need to be more. And how many, space management folks. We need to be talking a little bit more broadly, I hope. Although, don't get me wrong, I love Nexus Pro, but I just think that bigger conversations are probably better right now.
Yeah, that's something that a lot of members have expressed as well, as the conversation and the use cases really are that we need to be providing are growing beyond just BMS, beyond just HVAC, beyond just metering analytics. And I think Joe Gaspardoni has said something along the lines of there being 30 different IP connected systems in the building. And so there's a network of professionals around each one of those silos that we as Nexus people hope to bring them into the fold. So I think we should all be inviting them in. And certainly we're excited to meet them all.
Yeah, we definitely want to have more convergence, I think, as we move forward. I think that hopefully will happen more in 21 and 22. And you're beginning to see some of it already, but there'll be more of it.
Awesome, Shannon. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
It's great. I love it. Love what you do. And glad to be a part of it. So thanks.
All right, friends. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Nexus podcast. For more episodes like this and to get the weekly Nexus newsletter, which, by the way, readers have said is the best way to stay up to date on the future of the smart buildings industry, please subscribe at nexuslabs.online. You can find the show notes for this conversation there as well. Have a great day.